Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Yud Aleph. We're going to get started from the very bottom of Yud Amud Bet. Okay, the first part of today's daf is okay. The second is a middle section, which is quite complicated. For that, I did a study guide. I did a study guide from the beginning through the middle part, but the main part I'm going to share screen is when we get to that next section. So the first section has to do with this Mishna that we saw at the end of yesterday's daf, which is this three-way machloket. We're really only going to focus on mainly one of the opinions or the disagreement between two of the people about whether we say kachata kasham. This whole thing was really related to Rabbi Eliezer and the Mishna who came and said, remember this is the whole issue, okay, and if you haven't listened, there's enough extra shiurim on the site, both in English and in Hebrew, both daf mishalahen, and there's a gefet in Hebrew, as in English, but also Alana Steinhain, no, hers is actually about the bloods. I think last week was actually about lishma and lo lishma, and the whole idea of intent in korbanot. So, what we have here is, if, right, the whole basic premise, again, you have to really get this straight today, because today we're really going to go through the four different opinions in the Mishnah. If you do a korban with the wrong intent, depends on which one it is and what the wrong intent was for, is it disqualified or not. So the main opinion is only a chatat and a Pesach, when it's the time of Pesach, which today we'll get to the big machloket, what's considered the time of Pesach. But big machloket about, right, those two are different than all the others. That's Tanakama. Rabbi Eliezer says also the Asham. And why? Because kachatak Asham, in the end, they're the same. That's what we saw before. So now we have this question about all the blood. Okay, there's another machloket which has to do with kachatak Asham. When it talks about this pasuk, that all the blood of the sin offerings that are brought into the sanctuary are disqualified, right? They disqualify the korban. If you bring the blood inside, the blood's disqualified. Now, is it just the kachata? That's the rabbis. Their opinion we're going to have to understand. Rabbi Akiva says it's everything, because it says vichol, all, even though it says all sin offerings, but he really means, right, he says the all comes to include all offerings. And Rabbi Eliezer, who's consistent with his approach, well, if it's sin offerings, then it includes guilt offerings as well, the asham, because kachatat kasham, they're the same. So now the question is going to be the rabbis. Why don't they say kachatat kasham? So that's where we're going to start today. 2 lines from the bottom of Yud Amud Bet. Bishlama Rabbi Eliezer Kedikamartama. He gives his reason. Kachatat kasham. Ela Rabbanan, my time. So what's the reason of the rabbis who don't say that? Amar Rava. Asham nichnas damo lefnim pasul lo matzit amart. Kavachomer me'ola. Today we're going to have a lot of logical reasoning, which is going to be tricky because even the logical reasoning theoretically should be logical. What we're going to see today is, well, sometimes it's not the most logical thing in the world. So let's see. So he says, we're going to learn this. This one's not so complicated. The middle part of today's stuff will have very complicated logical arguments. Rava says, you can't say it because of a kavachomer from Ola. Ola is more strict than Asham. Why is it more severe, the halachot? Because ma'olashu he kalil, because the whole thing gets burned. The Asham, remember, okay, right, these are order of korbanot. Ola is the most severe because it all gets burned. Then under that you have Asham and Chata, which are kodesh kodshim, but the meat gets eaten by the male kohanim. So they're already less severe. So if the Ola, which is completely burned, and the blood goes in, it's not a problem, because, again, Rabbi Akiva thought it was, but the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer don't think it. Right now we're talking about those two opinions. It'll be fine, the dam. Asham she'eno kalil koshken. So all the more so in Asham. So we'll learn it from Ola. Very simple. But no, mala olash kenen and mechaper. On the one hand, Ola gets burned and therefore completely, and therefore it's more severe. On the other hand, it doesn't atone for any sins. No, it's true we did say it atones for positive commandments we didn't fulfill, but it doesn't atone for a negative commandment that I did. So in Ola's ena mechaperet, right? It doesn't have any kapara, any atonement element to it, and therefore the asham is more severe. And you could say it's because it atones. That's why if you bring the blood inside, maybe it would be disqualified. So we're back to square one. It doesn't help us. Well, minchat chote tochiach. Well, if you take the minchat of a chote, now that's a ola v'yored. Remember, sliding scale offering. You have a sin offering to bring. It's atones, right? But if you bring the komets, now the parallel in a mincha, there is no blood, but the parallel is the komets, which is like. Okay, remember we compared mincha. Mincha is compared to sacrifice. There's also 4 avodot. There's taking the kmitza, that's like shchita. There's bringing it to the altar, that's like holacha. There's collecting it in the kli sharet, first of all, putting it in the sanctified bowl, then a vessel, then bringing it, and then putting it on the altar, burning it. That's like smicha. So it has these parallel things, and if you bring the minchat chotei, the kmitza, into the sanctuary, it doesn't disqualify it. So there you have, ola is more severe because it's kalil, and minchat chotei is michaper, atones. So there you have it. We can learn from the 2 of them. So now breaking the action for a minute, and the Gemara says, hey, you could have suggested something else, which would have been even better. Why don't you use the chatara of, which was a sacrifice? It would be much stronger than just a meal offering, which doesn't even have blood or anything else, right? So chatara of will prove it. So they said, and right, because again, if you assume that the blood of the chatara of that goes inside the eichal isn't, now what's the difference between that and the chatat? Chol chatat means chatat of an animal. But the chatat of a bird maybe is different. So why don't we use that one to prove, if the chatat of a bird that the blood goes inside is not disqualified, then you can learn from there to the asham. But the reason is, they didn't use that is because Baya de Rabbi Avin because that's Rabbi Avin, we didn't know this, but Rabbi Avin asked a question about this. He wasn't sure if the blood of a bird goes into the sanctuary, is that included in the Pesach or not? In other words, we don't know if it's kasher or not. That's why they didn't use it as a proof. They would use it as a proof if it was clear what the halacha was, but it's not clear what the halacha is in that case. And therefore, okay, that was a total aside. Now we're back to this. We're going to learn from Ola and Chatara Oft and Minchat Chotei, together. V'lifroch, but can't you knock it out and say Mala Minchat Chotei Shekain Ena Min Zevach? But the Minchat Chotei can't even use it as a proof at all because it's not a sacrifice. It's a meal offering. There's no slaughtering, there's no blood, so you can't prove it from there. But Ola Tochiach. But again, we're going to use the combination of the 2 because Ola is, and yet it doesn't get disqualified when it goes in. B'chazaradin, we're going to do our classic least common denominator. Lo rizeh kirizeh, v'lo rizeh kirizeh. Even though the Minchat Chotei is not an offering, the Ola is. And even though the Ola is not atoning, the Minchat Chotei does atone. So, Hatzara Shaveh Sheben, what's the least common denominator? Shehem Kodshe Kodshim V'nichnas Lefnim Kshirim. They're both high-level sanctity, and when you bring them into the sanctuary, they're not disqualified. Af ani avi Hasham Shu Kodesh Kodeshim V'nichnas Lemo Lefnim Kasher. And that's the proof for the rabbis. Well, so we think. So the rabbis, if we keep going along this line, we have the combination of the 2 will prove that the Asham also, when the blood goes inside, it's not disqualified. And that gives us an opinion, like the explanation for the rabbi's opinion, which is what we were looking for. The problem is that Rava Mibarnish is going to knock this kal v'chomer. Because he's going to say, Amar le Rava Mibarnish le Rava Ashi. The lifrach, but you can knock it out and say, hey, the least common denominator there is not the same as Asham. Asham is more severe than the least common denominator of the Minchat Chotei and the Ola. Why? Because there's a unique stringency about Asham that's not in the Minchat Chotei and not in the Ola. And then we're going to knock out this whole logic, and then we're going to have to find a totally different explanation. There's no minimum amount of money you need to spend either on the Minchat Chotei or on the Ola. But Tomar ba'asham sheyesh lo kitzba, but the asham has a set amount. You have to spend at least 2 shiklei kesef. Okay, 2 shkalim's worth of silver on the asham offering. So therefore, you can't learn from the others to there because this has a unique stringency, and maybe then if you bring its blood inside, it will be disqualified. So now we're back to square one. Elahainu tamid de Rabbanan. So now we're going to bring a second possible answer to Rabbanan, and this will be more successful. Da'amar kra dama. Now the pasuk v'chol chatat asher huva midama. Okay, any blood of a sin offering that its blood is brought inside the sanctuary will be disqualified. Its blood means, right, dama, its blood. Only its blood, not any other blood, not the blood of the asham. And that's the drasha of the rabbis. Dama shel zo v'lo dama shel acher. Its blood and not any other blood. So that is the rabbi's opinion. Now, idach, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with that? He has asham also. Dama v'lo b'sara. He says its blood comes to exclude its meat. If you bring the meat into the sanctuary, that's not a problem. The only problem is bringing the blood in. And that's why it says its blood and not its meat. So, idach, what do the rabbis do with that? Also, they think the meat that goes in, so shouldn't dama teach you blood and not meat? Dam dama. Well, blood, if it had just said blood and not its blood and not meat. But because it says dama, its blood, so you can darshan both. Also blood and not meat, and also its blood and not the blood of the asham. V'idach, what about the Rabbi Eliezer then? What are they going to do if you have both those? Well, dam dama lo darish. He thinks you can only learn one thing from the word dama, and it's blood and not its meat. Okay, end of discussion. So that was the first part of this section. Okay, we're going to have 3 parts to this section. The first was to understand what is the explanation, what's the basis for the rabbi's opinion in that Mishnah that they disagree with, not our Mishnah, the Mishnah where they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer uses the kachatat ka'asham like he uses in our Mishnah. He uses it to say not just the blood of the chatat that goes into the inner sanctuary is going to be disqualified, also the blood of the asham. And the question is what the rabbis do with that and how do they darshan it's just the blood of the chatat. Now we're back to our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, they disagree with a sacrifice that's done shelo lishma. Again, just to review, according to the rabbis, a chatat shelo lishma will be disqualified. According to Rabbi Eliezer, a chatat and an asham. So now we're going to actually raise a question on Rabbi Eliezer. But again, not from this Mishnah we just quoted, but from our Mishnah from the very beginning of Daf Bet. So Bishlama l'Rabbanan da'amre asham shechato shelo lishma kashel hainu di'itakish mincha lechatat mincha la'asham. Okay. You don't know this yet, but we're about to read a braita. And in that braita, they're going to compare, and they're going to say there's a mincha that's like a chatat, and there's a mincha that's like an asham. And they're basically going to say the mincha that's like a chatat is going to be disqualified if it's shelo lishma, and the mincha that's like an asham is not going to be disqualified if it's shelo lishma, because it's like an asham. Well, that's obviously going to only fit with the rabbis and not with Rabbi Eliezer. And they're going to say, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with that? And because it's based on a pasuk, they're going to assume that Rabbi Eliezer has to read that pasuk somehow. So how's he going to read that pasuk? Okay, so that was all the background. Let's see it right now. Inside. Titanya. Okay, I'll just read the words again that we read. I'll explain them. The rabbis make sense even though we don't understand this yet because we didn't read on. But Bishlam ala Rabbanan, their position makes sense because in light of what it says, that asham sheshachato shelo lishma kasher. The rabbi's opinion that an asham shelo lishma is kosher is a good sacrifice. Again, it doesn't work for the owner, but it does get sacrificed. That's why there's this hekesh of a mincha to a sin offering and another kind of mincha to a guilt offering. Okay, because there's this differentiation, and we're going to see differentiation whether lishma is pasul or kasher. Okay, and then we're going to say, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, which we haven't gotten there yet because we're still mid-sentence, how's he going to read this braita? So let's read the braita. Ditanya. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Kodesh Kodeshimi Kachatat Kasham. This is in Vayikra chapter 6, where it discusses different mincha offerings. And it says the mincha is Kodesh Kodeshim, it's high-level sanctity, like the chatat and like the asham. Now that means what? The drasha of Rabbi Shimon is Minchat chote harei kechatat. What we're going to say is some are like a chatat, some are like an asham. So a sin offering, meal offering, the one of the sliding scale, if you can't afford anything you bring, right? You can't afford the basic. So you bring just a meal offering. That is like a chatat leficha. Kimtza shelo lishma psula. So if you did the kmitza, which is like the shchita, if you took the coin, took out, right, the part of the meal, right, you have a whole big dough in a bowl, and the coin sticks his 3 middle fingers and pulls out a little piece. That's the piece you take and burn on the altar. If he did that thinking, I'm doing this for the sake of some other mincha, it's disqualified. But minchat nidava, but if someone decides, not because they sinned, they're bringing the mincha, but because they just decide, I want to bring a mincha offering to the temple. So that kind of mincha is like an asham leficha. So if the kohen did the kmitza with the wrong intent, that I'm doing it for a mincha chote, let's say, for example, it's kasher. So what do you see here? This is obviously fits with the rabbis. What's Rabbi Elazar going to do with it? Rabbi Elazar, so maybe he doesn't hold like Rabbi Shimon, but then why does it say kachatat v'ka'asham, as if there's one like a chatat and there's one like an asham? So how do you have a mincha that's like a chatat and a mincha that's like an asham? So the answer, l'chi'idach to Rabbi Shimon. It comes for some other opinion of Rabbi Shimon, which appears in a Mishnah, ditnan, as it says in a Mishnah. And now we're going to explain. It's like a chatat, like an asham in a totally different way. Not having to do with lishma, lo lishma, because according to Rabbi Elazar, lishma and lo lishma are the same. Any chatat, any asham that's shelo lishma is disqualified. Okay? So he's going to explain it some other way. And it's actually going to also be Rabbi Shimon. Later, the Gemara is going to say, how does Rabbi Shimon darshan two totally different things from this pasuk? And we're going to have to explain that. But right now, that doesn't bother us. Right now, we're focusing particularly on how does Rabbi Eliezer compare chata and nasha. And we find a source from this in the Mishna. Shelo b'klei sharei psula v'Rabbi Shimon machshir. You're supposed to, as I said with the kmitza, you're supposed to take the kometz, take this piece out with the Kohen's 3 middle fingers. Okay, we'll learn all about this later. We have all of Masechet Menachot to get through. And the Kohen takes it. It's called like a difficult avoda to do. Kohen takes it, takes that piece, that chunk of dough, puts it in a klei sharet. Okay, just like the collecting of the blood. Same thing. It has to go in a klei sharet. These are the comparable activities. Then they bring the klei sharet to the mizbeach, and then with the blood, they sprinkle it on the altar. With the mincha, the komet, they burned it on the altar. Okay? But according to Rabbi Shimon, if you did it by hand, meaning you took the kmitza, the kohen, and you just carried it to the altar, it's okay. It's valid. Okay? According to the rabbis, it's disqualified. It has to go into that klei sharet. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's okay. By the way, they put the mincha in a klei sharet twice. First, they put the whole dough in the klei sharet. Then they take out a kmitza, and then they put, the whole thing about putting it in a vessel is to sanctify it. So the mincha is 2 times, because then you put the kometz in. Okay, but we're not going to deal with that right now. So he says, the second time it doesn't have to go in a klei sharet. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda Bereda Rabbi Chia, my time Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, comes to explain what's the reason for Rabbi Shimon, and we're going to see it's based on this pasuk. Amar Kra, Kodesh Kodeshimi, Kachatat V'Chasham. How so? Now, he's going to say, sometimes it's going to be like a chatat, sometimes it's going to be like an asham, not for lishma lo lishma, because he thinks they're the same for that, but for something else. Bala ovda biyad, ovda biyamin kechatat. If you did it by hand, and you brought it by hand to the altar, it has to be in the right hand of the kohen. Has to be like a chatat. A chatat has to happen in the right hand of the kohen. But bikli ovda b'smo ke'asham. An asham can be done in the left hand of the kohen, can be brought to the altar with his left hand. It's less severe than the chatat. And therefore, if it's in a vessel, we now have the split. Kachatat kasham is, are you bringing it by hand, or are you bringing it in a vessel? If it's brought in a vessel, then it could be brought in the kohen's left hand. Okay, we're not going to get into all the reasons for this. That's just the point. Okay, that's what he darshans for this. So now we have our answer to our question. Okay, the second sugya we had today within this Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer was actually, the first one was a question of the rabbis. What's the basis for their opinion? The kol chatat doesn't include the asham also. Then we had, how does Rabbi Eliezer understand this split kachatat kashan? Something's like a chatat, something's like for a completely different halacha. So now they just go back and ask the side question. Rabbi Shimon, how could Rabbi Shimon learn 2 completely different things from this kachatat kashan? Because we saw 2 sources. The real way Rabbi Shimon reads that pasuk is for the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda, and the minchat chotei d'psuah shelo l'shma tam achrinahu. The first halacha we learned from there, that a minchat chotei is pasul if it's lo l'shma. Rabbi Shimon actually learns it from a different source. Okay, even though it said Rabbi Shimon learns it from this source, that's what we call an asmachta. It's just he connected it to that verse as a mnemonic, so we remember it's not really where he darshaned it. He really darshaned it from the following pasuk. How do you know that a mincha chotei that was done shelo l'shma is like a korban chatat that's done shelo l'shma? He learns it from chatat tamamai. Where do we get that a chatat has to be done l'shma? We've learned this. Dichtiv ba hu. Okay, it says he, it should be who. Chatat hu. Remember? It says chatat hu. This chatat has to be done l'shem chatat. If it's not good. Well, mincha chotei nami ktiv ba he. It also says chatat he by the minchat chotei. So since it says the same language, from there we really get the chatat. He just happened to say, kachatat kasham, as a cute way to remember, there's minchat nedava, that's different, minchat chotei is different than that. Okay, but really it comes to the word who and he. Okay, last question in this section until we get to the challenging part for today. Now, third question in this whole thing. We still have that pasuk that we saw before, right, where Rabbi Eliezer darshans, asham and chatat are the same. So what do the rabbis do with that pasuk? And the answer is, lomar lecha ma chatat tu'na smicha, af asham ta'un smicha. That's to teach you the laws of smicha. Okay? The laws of smicha. are written in the Torah. Now, this is something we're going to learn throughout Masechet Zevachim. In Masechet Zevachim, you might think, if I asked you, without looking carefully, asked you, do you think the Torah tells you a lot of details about the korbanot? If you've seen through Parshiot, right, in Vayikra, you'd say, we get a ton of details. Torah really details out everything, right? What you do with each korban, what are all the criteria, what are all the details. But in fact, we're going to learn Masechet Zevachim, there's a lot of details missing. It seems like a lot of details, and once you look at it, you see that certain details are mentioned by some sacrifices and not by others. Like smicha isn't mentioned by Hashem. Does that mean you don't do smicha? So the rabbis say, the Pesach that compares Kachatat Ka'asham is saying the Hashem is like the Chatat in the sense that smicha is also by the Hashem. And there are going to be all these comparisons where it says something somewhere and we're going to learn from one to the other because all sorts of details aren't mentioned. And the question is, are they not mentioned because you don't have to do them, or are they mentioned, referenced some other way? Oh, it doesn't say smicha, but the Hashem needs smicha. And we learn it from the comparison, from the Pesach that compares Chatat and Hashem. Okay? And that's what he does with that. Okay. Now we're going to move to the third opinion in our Mishnah. Again, going back to Bet Amud Aleph, Yosef and Honi said, not just Pesach and Chatat Shelo Lishmar Psulim, but if you did any other korban l'shem Pesach, if it's the 14th, okay, if we're on Bismano, or any other korban for a Chatat all year round, it's also disqualified. It goes in both directions. Chatat lo lishma and Pesach Bismano shelo lishma, and the reverse. Some other korban, we're going to call it acherim, a different korban, l'shem Pesach, Bismano, or a different korban, l'shem Chatat, all year round, are going to also be disqualified. So now comes Rabbi Yochanan. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Yosef ben Honi and Rabbi Eliezer are davar echad. Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Yosef ben Honi. Okay? Even though we didn't see that, okay, we're going to see it in a braita. And Rabba Amar ba'acherim l'shem Chatat pligi. He doesn't agree with him completely, says Rabba. He only agrees with him in the Pesach, meaning if you do a different korban, l'shem Pesach, it's disqualified. If it's the 14th, okay, whether afternoon or not, we'll deal with that later. But if you do a different korban, l'shem Chatat, that's not disqualified. How do we know that? To get to that, we're going to go through a very long braita, and the second to last line in this braita is going to prove that. Okay? Now, some people think this is just a side point that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabba disagree. Rabbi Yochanan thinks that Yosef ben Honi and Rabbi Eliezer say completely the exact same thing. That he agrees it goes in both directions. Rabba says it's only in one. Okay, it's only in the l'shem Pesach, not l'shem Chatat. But I think Tosfos Pshat makes a lot more sense because there's really no source for saying they disagree in both. There is a source for saying they only disagree in one, and that's this braita, and that Rabba is coming to qualify what Rabbi Yochanan said. It's true he agrees with him, but he agrees with him only l'shem Pesach, and Rabbi Yochanan just didn't explain that, but that's really what Rabbi Yochanan meant. Okay, that's just a side point. So now let's get to the braita. Okay, for this I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I will share screen, and we'll start going through the study. Okay, this is important to follow, otherwise it's very confusing. Okay, here we go. So we're going to start on the second side of the study guide. I wanted to put this all on one sheet so you see. Ditanya. HaPesach she'ibrash nato v'shachato b'zmano lishmo. Okay, this is not important for our purposes, but this is a Pesach where the korban was already past its date that you can use it, which is once it's more than 1 year old, you can't use it. So we got to Pesach and it got too old. And you then slaughtered it on Pesach, l'shem Pesach. Okay, we're going to see this on Machlokes Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua. Is this completely disqualified or is it a kosher korban? Meaning, can you still go ahead with bringing it or not? V'chein hashochet, this is the key one, hashochet acherim l'shem Pesach bizmano. Okay, here you're going to see this is exactly what Rabbi said. Rabbi Eliezer said, because he said he disagrees about this. He agrees with, right, he disagrees with him about the chata, but he agrees with Yosef ben Honi about this. If you slaughter a different sacrifice, like a shlamim, an ola, anything, l'shem Pesach, in the name of Pesach, bizmano, when it's the 14th, so Rabbi Eliezer posel, Rabbi Yoshua machshir. So the Pesach goes in both directions. Now, we don't know anything about the Chatat. We're going to wait for the very last sentence, the second to last sentence, to see that a Chatat, he doesn't think this is the case. Okay, and that's what Rabbi was trying to say. But here you see, l'shem Pesach is going to be disqualified. Okay, now we're going to have, each one's going to bring logical theory to this. Okay, Amar Rabbi Yoshua. In Bishar Yamot HaShana, she'eno kasher l'shmo, achirim kshirim l'shmo. Okay, we have to get this. And I don't want you to get too bogged down by the words. I want you to get into the concept. The concept of Rabbi Yeshua's logic is going to be like this. He's going to compare a Pesach when it's not the time for Pesach and a Pesach when it is the time for Pesach. And his first argument is going to be that a Pesach l'shem Pesach, okay, if I do a Pesach, I take an animal that was designated for Korban Pesach, and it's not the time for Korban Pesach, and I do it l'shem Pesach, it's disqualified, okay, because it's nothing, right? I can't do a Pesach l'shem Pesach when it's not Pesach. But when it's Zmano, when it is the time for Pesach, and I do it l'shem Pesach, it's kasher. Based on that, okay, now he's going to say that shows Bizmano we're more lenient. When it's time for Pesach, we're going to be more lenient. So now comes his logic, and he says the following. Okay, let's go back to the line we read. If Bishar Yemot HaShana, regular time of year, it's not kasher if we do it l'shem Pesach, and yet Achirim Ksherim Lishmo. If I take a shlamim and I say I'm doing this l'shem Pesach, it's actually not disqualified. I can still bring it. Now I bring it as a shlamim. I don't bring it as a Pesach, but it's kasher. That's what we learned. Shlamim shelo lishma or ola shelo lishma is kasher. Doesn't matter if I do it l'shem Pesach or not. So if Pesach shelo b'zmano is more strict, because if I do it l'shem Pesach, it's not going to be good. And yet I take a different korban and I do it l'shem Pesach, it's kasher. So let's take that whole thing b'zmano. If we move now to the time of Pesach, Bizmano shu kasher lishmo, that if I do it l'shem Pesach, it's actually good. So eino din shichshavu achirim lishmo. Wouldn't you then say, isn't it obvious that achirim l'shem Pesach is going to be kasher? Okay, now that's what Rabbi Yoshua says. If I take a shlamim on Pesach and I do it l'shem Pesach, it's fine because it's not a Pesach shelo lishma, it's an achirim shelo lishma. That's what Rabbi Yoshua says is kosher, and that's what Rabbi Eliezer disagrees about. So basically, again, his logic is, if shelo b'zmano, the Pesach l'shem Pesach is disqualified, and on zmano, it's actually Pesach l'shem Pesach is good, that's what you're supposed to do, that means that we're going to be more lenient in general b'zman Pesach. And if we're more lenient, then if achirim l'shem Pesach is kasher, then achirim l'shem Pesach is going to be kasher also b'zman. Okay? Now, Rabbi Elazar is going to have two claims against this. Then Rabbi Yoshua is going to knock out Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, and then Rabbi Eliezer is going to start a whole second slew of logic. Okay, so the claim of Rabbi Eliezer is this: he says your logic is not sound, basically. Okay, he says Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, your logic can take you to an absurd conclusion. If you're going to claim, okay, if you look here, the way I sorted it, the way I did it on the page. We're going to keep the same Pesach l'shem Pesach is pasul b'shelo b'zmano, and Pesach l'shem Pesach is kasher b'zmano. But what we're going to flip is, instead of achirim l'shem Pesach, we're going to do Pesach l'shem achirim. Okay? And then he's going to basically say, your logic, if you take it as, well, shelo b'zmano is more strict, so if something's kosher, shelo b'zmano, for sure it's going to be kosher b'zmano, and we're going to get to a conclusion that even Rabbi Yoshua doesn't agree with. Okay? So, Umay b'shar yemot hashana she'eno kasher lishmo. So if you're going to say b'shar yemot hashana, all days of the year when it's not Pesach, you do a Pesach l'shem Pesach, it's no good. And yet kasher hu l'shem achirim. You take a korban Pesach. I designate this animal for a Pesach. I slaughter it on Purim, okay, for the sake of some other korban. It's kasher because the only disqualification, remember, is Pesach bizmano, not Pesach shelo bizmano. So take that, right? Kasher l'shem achirim. So bizmano shu kasher lishmo. So again, take this logic. When it's the time of Pesach and it's kasher l'shem Pesach, so it's more lenient. Eino din. So what would be the logic? Pesach l'shem achirim should be kasher, right? Eino din shuchshar l'shem achirim. I do a Pesach l'shem some other korban. It should also be kasher then. And nobody thinks that. That's absurd. Yuchshar Pesach b'arba'asar shelo lishmo. That was the basic halacha. A Pesach, when it's time for korban Pesach that you do in the name of another korban, it's for sure disqualified. But your logic would lead you to say it's kasher. Okay, again, all these switches is, instead of achirim, l'shem Pesach, he switches Pesach, l'shem achirim in those two slots, and you get to an absurd conclusion. And the second, he says, if you're going to say that these two things are dependent on each other, you'll also come to a ridiculous conclusion. So then he says, v'chachat ha'omer, and this is what you're saying, mali huchshiru achirim b'shar yemot hashana lishmo, Shekain hu kasher l'shem achirim. Okay, what he's going to do here is say the following: Pesach for achirim, when it's lo zman Pesach, right? When it's not the time of Pesach, is kasher, and therefore achirim l'shem Pesach is kasher. In other words, you're connecting. He's saying to Rabbi Yeshua, if you're really connecting these two things, then, okay, here he's not talking about Pesach l'shem Pesach anymore. He's taking the other two. We had acherim l'shem Pesach and Pesach l'shem acherim. So he's basically going to say like this. I'm going to read the words again. Mali huchshiru acherim b'shar yemot hashana lishmo. That's the second one here. Acherim l'shem Pesach is kasher. Why? Because, and that's why I switched the order. I put the Pesach first because it's kasher l'shem acherim. In other words, when it's not Pesach, if you do a Pesach in the name of another korban, right, by accident you do it l'shlamim, it's kosher because it's not the time for Pesach anyway. And acherim, and then based on that, you would say acherim l'shem Pesach will be kasher. That those two things are connected, okay? So if you do that, then you're going to come to a ridiculous conclusion, because if you apply that to bismano, and you say, yuchshiru achirim bismano lishmo, you're going to basically say that achirim l'shem Pesach are going to be kasher, which again, right? No, this is exactly their machloket. He's saying, you're going to say they're kasher, achirim l'shem Pesach, why? Shekenu pasul l'shem achirim. Now, you can't say they're kasher, because if these two things are connected, then bismano, let's just go through. If it's Pesach, right, the time of Pesach, and you take a Pesach, and you slaughter it l'shem achirim, it's for sure pasul. So based on that, again, we connected shelo bismano, Pesach to achirim, right? Pesach l'shem achirim to achirim l'shem Pesach. These are flipped, right? Pesach for the sake of other korbanot, and other korbanot for the sake of Pesach. If shelo bismano, that's kasher and that's kasher, then bismano, you would say if Pesach l'shem acherim is pasul, then acherim l'shem Pesach is kasher. Is pasul. And that's not true. You're saying they're kasher, but it should be pasul because these things are interconnected. Okay. Now, Rabbi Yoshua is going to say, you can't possibly say all that. Why not? Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, im kain, you come to a crazy conclusion what you're saying, Rabbi Eliezer. If you really want to say that acherim l'shem Pesach is pasul, that it's yud daled. I have a shlamim. I do it l'shem Pesach, it's disqualified, or I have an ola, I do it l'shem Pesach, disqualified, because again, it goes in both directions. That's what Rabbi Eliezer is trying to say. He says, Hurata koach Pesach v'natata koach b'shlamim. You're making Pesach less severe than shlamim. And we've been talking about that the whole thing is that Pesach is more severe. That's why the Pesach and the chatat shelo lishma are worse, right? But you're making shlamim worse. Now, here again, this is what's hard. The way I like to explain this is in the world of statistics. Okay, you can take a statistic and look at it from a particular slice of it and prove anything you want, really, right? Statistics can be played with to prove what you want. This is what we're doing here. We're taking, if you look from a very particular angle, there's something totally illogical about it. Okay, and what he's going to say here is, if you look from this particular angle, you're going to say that shlamim is more severe than Pesach, and that's absurd. And that's how Rabbi Yoshua knocks out Rabbi Eliezer. Because, okay, now the Gemara doesn't say this, but I brought it here to explain it to you. How is Pesach weaker than shlamim here? Because according to what you're saying, he says to Rabbi Eliezer, again, that it goes in both directions, that acherim l'shem Pesach will be disqualified. If you slaughter a Pesach for the sake of a shlamim, when it's a time for shlamim, meaning all year long, it's going to be kosher, right? A good korban, because that's what we've been saying. But then a shlamim that you slaughter l'shem Pesach when it's a time for Pesach is going to be disqualified. He's comparing a Pesach in the name of a shlamim in the time of shlamim to a shlamim in the name of Pesach in the time of Pesach. That's why I say he's looking at a very particular slice. Okay? But a shlamim in the name of Pesach in the time of Pesach is going to be disqualified. That means we're more strict about a shlamim than we are about a Pesach. Now, obviously, a Pesach is shelo bismano, and the shlamim we're talking about a Pesach bismano. It's a little bit of a confusing logic, but he knocks out Rabbi Eliezer with this. So Rabbi Eliezer starts again. Now, again, we're all getting into this for this line in the next section, okay? We're getting within this line of Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Eliezer doesn't respond, okay? So, remember why we're here. We want to see that Rabbi Eliezer holds like like Yosef and Honi, that it's bi-directional, but only by Pesach and not by Shlamim. Now, not by Chatat. This discussion has only been about Pesach, not about Chatat. But here we're going to soon add something about Chatat. So the second claim of Rabbi Eliezer is the following. Chazal Rabbi Eliezer v'dano din acher. So he tries a different logic. Matzinu motar Pesach b'shlamim ve'em motar shlamim b'Pesach. If you have an extra korban Pesach after Pesach is over, you bring it as a shlamim. Okay, you designate it, you never used it for whatever reason, you now use it as a shlamim. But an extra shlamim can't be brought as a Pesach. If I, let's say, promised to bring a shlamim to the temple, I brought 2 animals. As I said, if something happens to one, I'll use that one, the other one, and then I use the first one, and I'm left with the second one. I can't bring that as a Pesach, right? Obviously, I can't. It wasn't designated as a Pesach, even though an extra Pesach can be brought as a shlamim, because remember, a Pesach is a type of shlam. So now, if Pesach, shemotaro b'shlamim, and shachato bizman l'shum shlamim is pasul, so a Pesach, whose motar, extra, can be brought as a shlamim, and yet, even though that's a leniency, if you slaughter it, l'shem shlamim, it's going to be disqualified because everybody agrees about that. Any Pesach that you slaughter, shalo l'shem Pesach is pasul. So a shlamim she'ein motaram ba Pesach. So the shlamim, which is more strict, because you can't even bring its extra as a Pesach, wouldn't you then be logical to say what Rabbi Eliezer wants to prove? Shachatam l'shem Pesach bizmano eino din shu psulim. If you slaughter it in the name of Pesach, when it's Pesach, wouldn't you think it would be pasul also? Okay, based on the first part, the Pesach, shemotaro b'shlamim, and you slaughter it, the shem shlamim is disqualified. So the shlamim, which can't ever be brought as a Pesach, don't you think if you do it in the name of Pesach, it'll be disqualified? Okay, that's what he says. So, now turning to Amud Marlo Rabbi Yoshua. This is the line we've been waiting for. Matzinu motar, and then we're almost done with this line of reasoning, okay, if you're getting confused by it. It's quite confusing. Matzinu, if we take what you said about motar Pesach to compare to motar shlamim, we'll take the same thing from motar chatat to ola and motar ola to chatat, and then we'll come to some also ridiculous conclusion that even you don't agree with. Okay? It's exactly what Rabbi Eliezer did in the previous to Rabbi Yoshua. He said, take your logic, we'll get to something ridiculous. So Rabbi Yoshua is going to say to him that. Matzinu motar chatat ba ola. Okay, a motar chatat can come as an ola. You have a chatat that's left over. Again, you took 2 chatats, 2 animals. You used one left, right? The second one was left over. You can bring it as a voluntary ola offering, but you can't bring an ola that's left over as a voluntary chatat because there's no such thing as a voluntary chatat. So ein motar ola ba chatat, and yet, okay, let's go to chatat. We're going to do the exact same comparison. Ma chatat shemotara ba ola. So you can bring an extra chatat as an ola, but if you slaughter it, shachatat l'shem ola psula. If you slaughter it for an ola, it's going to be completely disqualified. And yet, in ola she'ein motara ba chatat, but an ola that can't be brought as a chatat if it's left over, and yet if you slaughter it l'shem chatat, eino din shtei psula. Your logic would say it would be pasul, and nobody thinks it's pasul. Ding, 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 ding. That's what we were looking for. What do you see here? You take a different korban, you slaughter it for a chatat. Nobody thinks it's pasul, and even Rabbi Eliezer doesn't respond. Oh, I think it's pasul also. That's exactly, this is the comparison. L'shem Pesach on Pesach is pasul, right? A shlamim l'shem Pesach, or an ola l'shem Pesach, or anything l'shem Pesach. But an ola or shlamim or anything l'shem chatat is not pasul. Okay? Because Rabbi Yoshua basically says you'll get to the logic that l'shem chatat will be pasul. Nobody thinks pasul except for Yosef and Honi. Okay? But not Rabbi Eliezer. So he doesn't respond by saying, I think that is pasul, which, right, if you agree with Yosef and Honi across the board, he would say, that's also pasul. But he doesn't say that, and that's our proof. But we're going to end with the last line that Rabbi Eliezer gets in. He has the last line here, although I will tell you that the note in the Schottenstein, because I was having trouble understanding this logic as well, in addition to some of the other, many of the other logics on this page, and the note in the Schottenstein basically says, L'chora tshuvat Rabbi Eliezer eina muvenet. Okay, it says, really this answer of Rabbi Eliezer isn't so clear. So if you don't understand it so well, don't worry, neither did the commentary here, okay, and raises some problems with it, but anyway, we're going to try to understand it. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer lo, im amarta bechatat, there's a certain leniency about a chatat, which is what? That you could, basically what he's going to say, I'll tell you outside, you can bring a chatat all year round. You can only bring a Pesach one day of the year. And that makes Pesach more severe, which is why, now, again, why this would mean that the ola that's slaughtered l'shem chatat is not disqualified, and the shlamim that's slaughtered l'shem Pesach bizmanu is disqualified. That's, I think, the confusion, what's not so clear cut from it. But he does say there's a chumrah about, right, the Pesach, that it can only be brought one day of year. Okay? So let's read it inside. The chatat is kasher all year long, and therefore there's more chances of it being, right, if you do something l'shem chatat, it'll be, more accepted. But tomar bePesach she'enu kasher l'shmo ela bezmano. But the Pesach is only going to be kasher when you do it l'shem Pesach only one day a year. Ho'ilvu pasul lishmo, since during the year it'll be disqualified if you do a Pesach l'shem Pesach. Dinu shi pasul acherim lishmo. So from there, logic would say, again, some sort of logic would say that if others were sacrificed l'shem Pesach on Pesach, it's also disqualified. Okay, that's a hard logic to fully understand, as was a lot of the logic in this daf. So if you were confused, don't worry. But that was the back and forth. We really brought this just for that one line before that last line. Rabbi Yoshua's claim, and Rabbi Eliezer doesn't disagree. And from there you have what Rabbi said, which is he agrees with Yosef and Honi, Rabbi Eliezer, specifically about the l'shem Pesach bismano will be disqualified. Goes in both directions, but not about a chatat, and that was clear from that line. Okay, now we're moving to the last opinion in the Mishnah, Shimon Azaria. Okay, why was he named the brother of Azaria? 2 reasons. One is maybe Azaria was the father of Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, and therefore they wanted to give him yichus. Another is that Shimon, he learned, and his brother Azaria supported him, and because of that, he gets the thing named for him. And he said, if you remember, it goes higher level, it'll be good. Lower level, it'll be worse. If you do it l'shem a higher level, it's valid. If you do it l'shem a lower level, it's not valid. Rabbi Shimon mishmei Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar Rabba matni mishmei Rabbi Yanai. Okay, either Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Yanai said this. My time is Shimon Azaria. Da Amar Kra. What's his proof pasuk? Below yechalalu kodshei bnei Israel asher yarimu laHashem. You will not desecrate the sacrifices of the people that they offer up to God. Now, yarimu means they go up. So what do they learn from here? B'mulam mehem emet chalalim. If you go up in level, they won't be disqualified. But if you go b'namuch mehem, you go down in level, mitchalalim. To which the Gemara says, how could you possibly learn that from that pasuk? We use that pasuk for something else entirely. That's learned for what Shmuel said. How do you know if you eat tevel, untithed produce, you get the death penalty? And that's learned from this pasuk as well. What does it mean, et asher yarimu? Yarimu is future tense. It's talking about things you will offer up, meaning you will take the Truma Masrot. So now, don't desecrate the Kodashim of Bnei Israel that you haven't yet yarimu, right? You'll desecrate them by if you didn't take the Truma Masrot and you eat them. Now, it doesn't say death in that pasuk, but there's a different pasuk, Umetu o Yechalalu, and they connect the Yechalalu, and they connect it to that pasuk, even though that pasuk is something else. But anyway, that's an aside. In Cain, so now what do they say? Right? In Cain, l'chtov kra asher hurmu ma asher yarimu shma min atarte. You can learn 2 things, because if it was just teaching one thing, our thing, it would have said hurmu, that were raised, because it's talking about if it was raised, it's not disqualified. The fact that then it moves it into future tense teaches you 2 things. Future is the tevel, and just the root itself, raising things up, teaches you our halacha. By Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera now asks, when Shimon Azaria comes and disagrees, right, he disagrees completely, because it's not this chata pesach, it all just depends the level, the order. Now, ksherim ve'en meratzim, v'chi pligi b'chada pligi, does he mean, if you go up in level, they're ksherim, but they don't atone for the sin, right, or they don't, right, remember, lo alu l'ba'alim l'shem chovah, doesn't fulfill their obligation, and then he only disagrees about one point, or maybe it means they're kshirim and they atone, and he actually disagrees with both. Okay? He disagrees completely with everything that was said in the Mishnah. And maybe he thinks they're kshirim and the Baalim are yotzei yedei chovah if you went up in level. So Amar Rabbi Beteira Rabbi Zreika, they're going to try to prove this from the words of the Mishnah, but then they're not going to succeed. If you remember, the Mishnah then gave some examples. What's going up, what's going down. So one of the examples they gave was the Bechor v'Maaser, sheshachatan l'shem shlamim kshirim, because Bechor and Maaser are lower level than Shlamim, even though they're all Kachim Kalim, but they're lower level. Shlamim sheshchatan l'shem bechor l'shem maaser psulim, and likewise, right, if you go the opposite direction, Shlamim, but you do l'shem something lower, it's disqualified. Now, Isa gadatach sherim umeratzim bechor baritzuyehu. Now, there is no ritzoy for a bechor. Bechor is the firstborn is born sanctified. You have to bring as a sacrifice, but there's no atonement. There's no obligation here that someone's fulfilling. If the animal's brought for l'shem something else and messed up, there's no ritzoy here. There's no right. The animal was already sacrificed. It doesn't matter. There's no I'll bring something in place of it to fulfill my obligation. It was take that bechor, and there's no ritzoy. So Ella, it must be ksherim ve'em meratzim. There is no ritzoy, so it's ksherim, but it's not meratzeh. It's a bit of a weak answer because there's no option for ritzoi, which we'll get to soon. But right now they're going to say, since that case there's no ritzoi, it must be all the cases are without ritzoi. And that would be your answer. He disagrees only with one. You could say, that one, there was no potential for ritzoi, so it's not miratze. But if there was a potential from ritzoi, maybe it would atone for the owner. So that doesn't help you. So then they say, okay, well then what's it coming? Why is that line there if not to teach us what we're trying to learn? Maybe it's not miratze in any of the cases because elamai. Kamashmalan, what does it teach you then? Gavov and amuch kamashmalan? It wants to teach you what's lower, what's higher, right? That this is high, this is low. Tanina, it already says, it already gave you an example of that in the Mishnah. Kochim kochim, shchatan l'shem kochim kalim v'chule. Right, I already told you, kochim kalim to kochim kochim. That's high, low. Why would it need to give you another example? Well, obviously, why would they need to? Because ma'od detema kochim 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 kalim hu deika gavoa v'namuch. Maybe gavoa v'namuch is only switching from kalim to kochim or kochim to kalim. But kalim v'kalim lo, but maybe within all kochim kalim we treat them all at the same level. Okay, but wait. Hanani Tanina, but we also learned that. That it comes in a different Mishnah later on in Masechet Zevachim on Daf Peitet. Shlamim kodmim et habachorim b'pnei sheim tunim matan arba usmicha disagreement between v'achaz v'shok. Shlamim come before bachor in terms of order of precedence because shlamim have more elements to them than the bachor does, and that already taught us level. So we don't need this Mishnah to tell us that. So we're back to what's this doing in the Mishnah? Maybe it's really to teach us about there's no ritzoi in any of them, but ha'ikar hahi agrara nasba. No. This is really the Ikar Mishnah where they're teaching you the levels. That one, because it went through every single korban, what's higher, what's lower, what's the order of precedence, it had to go into it there. But this is really its central place, and this is really just to tell you that within Kochim Kalim there's also hierarchies, and this has nothing to do with ritzoi or not ritzoi, and therefore we don't learn anything. Okay, moving out to the next Mishnah. Pesach. We're done with the first Mishnah, okay, finished. Now we're moving on to the second Mishnah, to a machlok that I mentioned a few times before. What about Pesach on Shacharit in the morning? Okay, we know that you bring the Korban Pesach in the afternoon of your Dalit, although today we'll suggest maybe not. Maybe you can bring it all day, okay? But right now, we're going to see, there's a machloket about what happens in the morning. Is that called bismano? And then if you shach this Pesach l'shem shlamim, is it disqualified because it's bismano? Or do we call that lo bismano? So Pesach shachato shachari barba asar shelo lishmo. You did it shelo lishmo. Rabbi Yoshua machshir ki'ilu nishcha b'shlosha asar. He says it's as if you did it yesterday because this is completely not the time for Pesach. Ben Beteira post-sale. He says it's disqualified ki'ilu nishcha ben arba'im because it's as if it was slaughtered in the afternoon. So he seems to be saying it is slaughtered in the afternoon, but in the morning it's still bismano because it's like as if it was in the afternoon. In the Gemara, we're going to understand this a little differently. Amar Shimon ben Azai, mekubalani mipnei shirim b'shnayim zaken. This is a different thing. This goes back really to the first Mishnah. I learned from these 72 zakenim, b'yom shoshivu Rabbi Elazar b'yeshiva, on the day that Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria took over from Rabbi Gamliel when they kicked him out in the whole famous story in Brachot. Shekol azvachim hane'echalim. Now this is key. All the zvachim that get eaten, meaning not the ola, but all the zvachim that get eaten, because the ola doesn't, everything except the ola is ksherim. This is a new opinion we didn't see before. But they don't, right, it still doesn't fulfill their obligation. Meaning, there's three exceptions. There's Pesach, Chatat, which are exceptions, and the ola is also an exception because that's not even eaten. So that one also, if you do it shalol l'shma, it's disqualified. That's a new opinion we didn't see. And the Mishnah points this out. The only difference he said was the ola. The ola is disqualified if it's shalol l'shma. But the rabbis didn't agree with him, even though he quoted the 72 Zkanim that were there at the time in Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, but they didn't agree with him. Okay, we're just going to start a little bit of the Gemara, and then we'll stop a little early and a little before we finish the daf, and we'll end there. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Oshaya, Machshir haya ben Beteira bepesach sheshachato shachari ba'arba'asad shmo dekula yom azimni. Now he understands this differently. Rabbi Oshaya, okay, Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Oshaya. The ben Beteira thinks the time of Korban Pesach is from the morning till the afternoon, all day, and that's why he says it's bismano. To which they say, then why does he say ki'ilu? My ki'ilu? Why did he say it's as if you slaughtered it in the afternoon, sounding like the real obligations in the afternoon? I did Rabbi Yeshua ki'ilu, Amar Yunami ki'ilu. Well, Rabbi Yeshua used the language ki'ilu, it's as if it's like the 13th. He said it's as if it's like the 14th in the afternoon. But really, He thinks the Korban Pesach could be brought all day long. We're going to have a whole question about this going forward. But one question for today, and then we'll stop. Then why is there machloket about lo lishma? They should argue about if you did the Pesach, l'shem Pesach in the morning, do you fulfill your obligation or not, right? Why is the whole thing, if you did it shelo lishma? The main machloket between them is, can you sacrifice the Pesach on your dalet or not? Why wouldn't they say that's the machloket? Well, if l'gu b'lishmo, havamina, aval b'shelo lishmo, modi Rabbi Yoshua ben Beteira. Because if their argument is, can you sacrifice the Korban Pesach in the morning? And Ben Beteira says yes. And Rabbi Yoshua says no. But maybe Rabbi Yoshua would say, but if you did it in the morning, shelo lishmo, maybe it will still be disqualified, even though you can't sacrifice it. It's close enough to the 14th in the afternoon, right? Ho'ilu miktsatova, since part of the day is the day for Korban Pesach, maybe you treat the 14th in the morning like the 14th in the afternoon, and maybe you would disqualify. That's why they wanted you to know the machloket is also about shelo lishma. If you do it shelo lishma, is this mano or not? Kamash malan. So now the whole question is going to be v'hakti bein arbaim, but doesn't it say bein arbaim? So two things here. Number one, we're taking the Mishna out of like the Mishna seems to say the machloket specifically lishma, and he says keilu, it's like you did in the afternoon, as if really the afternoon is the time. But the Gemara, right, the way Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Oshaya understands it, is that they actually disagree about two things. They disagree bichlal about can you sacrifice Korban Pesach in the morning, and then the question is going to be, but it says on the pasuk in the afternoon. So how do you explain that? And we'll get to that tomorrow. Okay, so today what we did was we started with this machloket Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Right, really grappling with kachata kasham, asking questions on the rabbi's position, first in this case about the dam of the chatat that went in, then back to the Mishna, asking about Rabbi Eliezer, how does that fit in with this other braita, and then asking about the rabbis, well, what's this pasuk kachata kasham, how do you deal with it? They're similar. Then we went to Yosef and Honi, and we learned that Rabba said that, right, Rabba and Rabbi Yochanan both think that Rabbi Eliezer actually agrees with him based on this braita, and we see that Rabbi Eliezer agrees that l'shem Pesach, when it's Zman Pesach, is actually disqualified, but he doesn't agree about the chatat. The shem chatat wouldn't be disqualified. It doesn't go two directions with the chatat, and that we had to go through that whole long, complicated braita to get to that one point where he basically they say, oh, it would be absurd. Rabbi Yoshua says to him, if you would say it's pasul in that case, acherim l'shem chatat, and Rabbi Eliezer doesn't respond, so he must agree that it's pasul. Right? He responds from some other way, but not that. He must agree that it's not pasul. And then we went to Shimon ben Azaria, and we understood what his source is, the Muram, right, that the higher level is okay, you go lower level, it's not. And then we said, does he disagree on two counts or only on one count? And then we finished up with the Mishnah about this machloket about the 14th in the morning, and we reinterpreted the Mishnah, not exactly in its simple reading. The machloket isn't necessarily just about shelo lishma in the morning, but also even lishma. What if you do it l'shem Pesach, or you yotze your chiyuv, or you're not? Okay, if it was slaughtered in the morning. Which raises the whole question about the Korban Pesach and what bein harbayim means. That we'll get to tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day, good fast, and a Gemara Chatima Tova.